Okay, here we go. So chapter 4 is about the spousal elective share. And this is basically, we have a will that does not leave property to the spouse. Okay. This has its origins in dower. Dower was a practice under the Old English common law, where if a man died, the woman would, rather his wife, would receive a third of his property upon death, right? We don't recognize dower. Most states don't recognize it. I believe it may have even been abolished in England, but we do still have this public interest in ensuring spouses are cared for regardless of the provisions of someone's will. So the remnants of that are in the spousal elective share. So this says basically no matter what someone says in their will, or if they give property right before their death to someone else, usually it was historically it's a mistress, right? So we have somebody who has someone else on the side and leaves all their property to that person and disinherits the spouse of 40, 50 years, right? So that's why we have this law. Sometimes it's used to help spouses that probably shouldn't be receiving the help, but nonetheless, it's a law, okay? The part of your project is how to calculate these amounts, and so I'm not going to give you too many directions on that. I want you to follow the instructions in your text and in the code, but there are a few things to think about, right? So first of all, it's part of the augmented estate. So what is that augmented estate? We're including not only things that might be in the probate estate that would be subject to the will, but everything that's outside of that: trusts, pay on death accounts, insurance beneficiary amounts, things like that, okay? So we're taking the augmented estate, everything they have, and then we're going to ensure that the spouse receives at least a third of that, roughly. So good luck with that calculation, right? Because it's roughly. There's all kinds of stuff on pages 32 and 33 that kind of show how to, what's included, what's not, which is why it's part of the project, right? I want you to learn. But a few words about premarital property. Anything that's received before the marriage or as part of inheritance or anything like that, that's considered separate property, okay? So it's not included in the augmented estate. However, we are going to presume that everything is marital property. So even though we may have this separate property, the presumption is that it's marital. So we have to have evidence or otherwise prove that it is indeed separate property if we don't want it counted. And that would include banking records, financial records, things like that, that could potentially prove that this was and always has been separate property. But the clearer the better, okay? There's a little bit on who may have to pay that out of pocket. What else did we want? Oh, so on page 35, the time limits on claiming the share. We have, it's the later of 9 months after the date of death or 6 months after the probate of the will, okay? So whichever one of those is later, that's the deadline for claiming the elective share, okay? A spouse may waive the elective share at any time before or after the marriage. However, waiving it after the marriage is a little tricky, right? Because there's no consideration, there's no adequate payment or compensation that can force or be binding upon a spouse in signing an agreement as to their rights as a spouse, if that makes sense. So if it's signed before the marriage in a prenuptial agreement, waivers of the elective share are easily enforceable. However, if we're trying to enforce that after the marriage in some kind of post-marital agreement, it gets really tricky to make sure that that's going to be enforced, and many times they're just not enforceable. Okay. Let's see, and I think that's it for chapter 4. The calculations are tricky, but there's plenty of information in the chapter to get you through that and to show for you to be able to start those calculations. Just go through the chapter line by line as you're going through your project and make sure that that you're not missing anything.